Okay, let's continue where we left off. Okay. It's a negative commandment not to mar. That means to razor shave an edge of the beard. And it says in Vayikra, neither shall you mar the edges of your beard. Beard has 5 edges, and there is the penalty of whiplashes for every single one. Thus, if all was taken off at once, there would be a violation of 5 prohibitions. The person is not punishable, however, until he shaves them with a razor. For that is a shaving which compromises marring, and is written, neither shall you mar. If a person shaved his head with the scissors, even using them as a razor, he would be free of penalty. Specifically, the one who does the shaving is punishable, but the one who is shaved receives no whiplashes, not until he helps the one shaving him. A woman is permitted to remove her beard if she has hair in the area of her beard. If she marred the beard of a man, she is free of penalty, but she is forbidden to do so. In Sefer Chinuch, it is written that a marring, razor shaving, one's beard, marring one's person's beard violates another 2 prohibitions besides the 5 mentioned above. These being, and in their fixed way you shall not walk, Vayikra, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment. Okay, so it's basically beautifying to look like a woman. That's it. So it goes back. I only saw that there. It's not actually, this is not talking about Avodah Zarah per se, Damon. It's talking about replicating what a woman's appearance is like.
Right.
Arthur? Should I continue? Should we wait for Arthur?
Continue.
Are you there, Arthur? Okay. Okay, but as I went, it was a continuation of yesterday. Okay, so negative, where did we say that? Okay, negative commandment that a man should not wear a woman's garment. Neither shall a man put on a woman's garment. A woman's garment denotes clothing and ornaments that are widely known in the city to be specifically for a woman. So too, if a man plucks white hairs from among the dark from his head, or even one hair, we did that. Sorry, apologies. Sorry, that's just, I went back. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, now this is shatnez. I don't know, Arthur, are you familiar with shatnez? Wool and linen? Okay, it's a negative commandment to wear no garment of wool and linen. And this also comes from Devarim. This is called kilayim, mixing of clothing. And it's also with crops as well. That term is used. Wool specifically means the wool of sheep and rams. Once wool and linen becomes combined by any sort of unification in the world, it is forbidden as kilayim by the law of the Torah. If a person wears kilayim, even by chance, temporarily, and even if it is over 10 garments, so that it does not benefit him at all, and even if it is only to get it past customs inspection, he violates this prohibition. So too, if one covers himself with it as a blanket, he violates this. By the law of the sages, it is forbidden to sit on mats spread of kilayim. Even if there are 10 soft spreads, one upon the other, and the bottommost one of them is kilayim, it is forbidden to sit on the uppermost one. So what happens if you buy a blanket and it's got different fibers in it, wool and linen? So I think it's just for wearing, not for, I don't know.
That's what I was going to ask. It's interesting.
Yes.
It's interesting.
Gavin put his thing on silent. He's, okay, anyway. Do you see that? I thought the main prohibition was wearing, but if you're getting better, what if it's cold?
It might be wearing.
Do you want to ask Rabbi Cohen if that only applies in times of the Beis Hamikdash? What do you say, Arthur?
I don't know if you guys know this, that the spacesuit, when they were trying to mix wool and linen together, they couldn't make it. They couldn't make it into airtight until they separated it and used them separately. When they tried to combine it, they couldn't. Yeah. I was on that course, but that's quite an interesting fact. So apparently they had no success. They mixed the two, but when they did them separately, it was fine. When it was kosher, it was fine. When it was unkosher, couldn't get a seal.
Jeez, that's interesting, eh? Yeah, Damien, ask Rabbi Cohen about that.
No, I don't want to trouble Rabbi Cohen about that, but the one thing I can tell you is that there's a rabbi in South Africa. His name's Bavli.
Yes.
So Bavli's got what you call a place called the Schottenstein lab. At the Czech dry cleaners, they've got his details, and he looks for shatnez, which is kilaim, with the wool and linen. And Arthur, it comes from that parsha with Cain and Abel. That's where it originally came from.
Okay.
In terms of the biblical prohibition. But Kevin's asking you a great question. Is it just for wearing or is it for use?
It said there for use. It actually said for use. It said a blanket.
Okay, so I don't know.
Because it also goes back. I don't know if you know the other halacha where you can't. We did it the other day, actually, 2 days ago. You can't mix. You can't. You can't work an ox and a donkey.
Correct.
And you can't mix breeds either. Breed 2 different breeds of animals.
Okay, I didn't know.
I think, yeah.
I'd just like to know why the actual thing is. Well, I mean, I understand food. You can't eat certain foods. I understand that, but why? I mean, if you're putting a blanket on you to keep you warm, but why is it there? Not.
But I'm explaining to you where it's from.
Okay, you told me it's from Canada. I heard that part.
Yeah, so basically what happened is they brought 2 different sacrifices which were not compatible with each other. That's where the schism occurred between wool and linen, naturally growing things, and things that man basically manipulates himself in order to get an outcome.
Okay.
So I'll try and see if I can get a shiur specifically on it, but that's where there's certain incongruencies, like certain crops that are man-made compared to crops that naturally grow. So all of these sort of schisms about also in terms of material that we process versus which grows naturally. The one is like cotton versus an animal. There's some difference between almost like the vegetarian, vegan sort of thing compared to what we process of an animal.
That's
quite interesting. Different breeds.
Is it?
Yeah.
We were on 28b3 yesterday and the day before, because yesterday we went through obviously Rabbi Cohen's notes. What we were discussing is we were going through Rabbi Nassan and we were discussing Rav Elazar in terms of culpability of damage for the pit if there was an original secondary factor that created the initial propulsion, and then is it at point of contact or is it at point of initial contact? So we've done that already. We've discussed that. What we're discussing now is a slightly different discussion with rubber and abaya. We did touch on it. So Rav Yehuda said where the owner of the pitcher had intent, he's liable. Where he did not have intent, he's not liable. So the Gemara was basically asking, what are the circumstances of the case where he did have intent? In other words, what manner of intent would cause the owner of the pitcher to be liable according to Rav Yehuda? So Abayas and Rabba have this discussion, and Rabba puts up a particular scenario. He said Rav Yehuda would refer to a case where he intended to take the pitcher down from his shoulder, but he stumbled while doing so, and the pitcher smashed against the wall. So basically, if it was a case where the pitcher was on his shoulder, it was a normal pitcher, and then that pitcher just disintegrated from a manufacturing default, so to speak. That's known as an unavoidable accident, and Rav Yehuda wouldn't hold the person liable as far as that's concerned. That's according to Rabba. If he was taking it off his shoulder, and while he did so, he slipped, that's an act of negligence, because as far as he's concerned, Rav Yehuda would deem that a person should look where they're going if you're doing a secondary activity. In other words, multitasking isn't a great thing, especially for guys. So it's not as if there was just, a disintegration without the effect of man interfering with that process. Does that make sense, guys? So in other words, if it came off his shoulder, but he did nothing to contribute to it, that's known as non-liability, because there was no intent. Intent is if you're not focused on the task at hand, and while you're pulling it off, you're talking, you're stumbling, you're not watching where you're going, and it smashes against the wall. That's Rabba's opinion. Abaya's got a slightly different opinion, which we'll see later, because he seems to hold that that Rav Yehuda is stating that a person is not liable should it come off the wall, smash against the wall in an unavoidable accident. But we're going to see that. So at this stage, Rabba, all you've got to know is he sees culpability of intent according to Rav Yehuda. According to Rav Yehuda, when he stumbles and falls as he's taking the pitcher off his shoulder. If it disintegrates from a manufacturing default, but there was no contribution by the person taking it off his shoulder, then he's not liable. Abaya said to Rabba, they're having a conversation now, but if Rabba Yehuda holds him liable if the pitcher broke as he took it down from his shoulder, it would follow that Rabba Meir is even more stringent than Rabba Yehuda in such cases, and he would hold him liable even if the pitcher disintegrated while on his shoulder. So the reason he would hold him responsible is Rabbi Meir was more strict than some of the rabbis of his generation. One of his stringencies is as follows, is that whether or not you intended to do it or not, did it cause damage? And since it did cause damage, your intention has nothing to do with it necessarily. Meaning in Shemaim, they hold you responsible to the extent that you were negligent, and it would be different to what your culpability is. So, for example, we used the scenario where I was on the way to a hypermarket and somebody threw a Coke bottle out the car in plastic. Now, say it was in the olden days of glass. That person in Shemaim would be completely responsible if somebody injured themselves on it. But if it fell out their window because a toddler dropped it out, in Shemaim, the person would not be as responsible for that particular breakage because they had no intent. However, the damage would be exactly the same. So Rabbi Meir is basically implying that if you caused the damage, whether your intent was there or not, you'd have to pay. And Rav Yehuda is only obligating in a case where a person was co-negligent in that particular factor because he wasn't watching where he was going, and therefore it disintegrated and not from a manufacturing default. Okay.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah, I just
very
wanted to
similar to
say
the one
something.
with some of the guy holding the pot and he's left the handles of the intention of putting it down. It's the same sort of concept where
What do you mean?
For responsibility. When the guy was holding the pot and the pot suddenly exploded and he was just left holding the handles, he was just holding it. To the one rabbi, he was not guilty. But if he had the intention of putting it down and he dropped it, then he was responsible.
Yeah.
Similar
So
sort of thing.
if there's any at the time for culpability of the person contributing, Rav Yehuda would hold them liable for damages. Rabbi Meir would say whether or not you have culpability or not, you're responsible for damages because somebody was injured.
Yeah.
Or their property was injured. So that's the bottom line.
Okay.
But the Gemara is not happy with this discussion with Rabbi Meir and opinion according to Rabba and Abaya. Because so basically Abaya turns around and said, listen, Rabbi Meir would hold him accountable even if the pitcher disintegrated on his shoulders. Rabba responds, indeed, Rabbi Meir would hold the owner of the pitcher liable, even if it disintegrated, leaving only its handle in its hand. So this is where the Gemara objects. It says, why would Rabbi Meir hold him liable in such a case? He is the victim of an unavoidable accident, and the merciful one releases one from liability for unavoidable accidents. And it's going to quote a verse here from Deuteronomy Devarim, and it's about concerning a betrothed girl. She was engaged and she was raped in the field, and it said, and to the girl you shall do nothing. So before I explain to you what this is about, I just want to share my screen, and then you guys will see where the biblical quote is. Just give me 1 second. Okay. So, Art, you want to read?
Yeah, okay. But if the man, okay, tell me where you start from.
There.
Okay.
But if the man.
Okay. But if the man comes upon the engaged girl in the open country, and the man lies with her by force, only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the girl. The girl did not incur the death penalty, for this case is like that of a man attacking another and murdering him.
Right. So the Gemara is basically using this example in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 26. Okay. And what it's saying is there's something deemed as an unavoidable accident. So girl's working in a field, she's betrothed, and some guy comes upon her, and I can't hear her screaming, and he rapes her. And why? Firstly, why would you think that the girl would be culpable at all? I just want to ask you because I just want to set up any errors that you might have, because they're using this example in Sanhedrin to basically state that she's not liable to the death penalty. What would you ever think that she'd be liable to the death penalty for, and how does it relate to this case? Then I'll explain it, but I want you guys to think of it.
Okay. Do you want me to go, or I'm just taking a stab?
Okay. No pun intended.
It's okay. So basically, you are not allowed to have marital affairs before you're married. First of all, okay, that's by the death penalty as well as when you're married with another man who's not your husband. Okay, so
Okay, how does this relate to the girl being culpable, though?
you mean being responsible or being?
Yes.
What's culpable mean? Culpable means be
Culpable
co-responsible.
means culpable. It means you're chayiv, you're obligated.
Okay, because
So what I'm
people.
saying is, why would you think a girl that was raped would be culpable in any manner? That's the first question. Gavin might know this from Sanhedrin.
I don't know from Sanhedrin. I'm just trying to guess.
All right. So
I would just use logic. I'm not sure from Sanhedrin, but I would say that the girl's not culpable. I mean, it's not. She had no intent of getting raped.
But why would you think she's even has slight intent, in the sense that why would this question even come up? That's what I'm asking you, Gavin.
What is the question? Sorry, I might have missed it. Sorry, because I'm trying to listen. I've got a washing machine running in the background.
No problem. So this is what it says. It says, listen, the Gemara is not happy with this conversation with the buyer and Rabba. Not that the Gemara is arguing with the two of them. These are great men. But that their view is automatically that Rabbi Meir would hold a person liable if there was a manufacturing default and the guy's got a picture on his back and the whole thing disintegrates, they'd say Rabbi Meir would make the person liable. So they're saying Rabbi Meir might not make the person liable because Rabbi Meir might see this as an unavoidable accident. Okay, that's the first thing. They're saying you can't necessarily say that he would make that person liable. So it's now bringing this fact from Deuteronomy about a girl in a field. All of a sudden, it's bringing this girl in a field that was raped, and we're saying that she's not going to get the death penalty as well. What would we think that these two cases have anything to do with each other, number one? And what would you think that she would possibly be responsible in any way, shape, or form for being raped?
I would think it was an unavoidable accident, you know.
Yes, but why would you think that the Gemara might hold her culpable? So let me just put you guys
Because sometimes people, I don't know from Sanhedrin, but just from just general cases, it happens because of the fact sometimes girls will end up going back to the guy's tent or to the guy's bedroom to have a chat, a meeting, and obviously it can lead to other stuff, you know. So you can land yourself in a compromising position. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, so this is not the case because, as you read from the biblical verse, it says if the man comes upon the engaged girl in the open country and the man lies with her by force, only the man who lay with her shall die, but you shall do nothing to the girl. The girl did not incur the death penalty. For this case is like a man attacking another and murdering him. So I just want to quickly put you guys out of your misery because I need to cover a little bit around it. So the first thing of it is we've learned a principle that there's three things that you have to give up your life rather than transgress. This is what we learned in Sanhedrin. Committing murder, committing acts of sexual immorality, and committing idolatry. Those are things that you need to give up your life rather than transgress. Does that make sense? So one of the questions that would come up is that, but surely a person needs to give up their life and possibly risk dying rather than transgressing any sort of sexual morality if she's married, and maybe they hold it culpable because she's married, she should rather give up her life. This was discussed in Sanhedrin. And the reality is there's a difference about what's done at the time and bidi evet after the fact. So, there are certain cases where Rav Schottenstein discussed where the girl was forced, where she couldn't actually resist because he physically overpowered her. That was a case. There's also a case where at the time she didn't have sound presence of mind. It's not as if they gave her free choice where somebody put her in a room and had a conversation and said, listen, we're either going to kill you or you can choose to do this act, where she could rationally think it out. This was a shock of note. So therefore, we're very careful to not automatically make her culpable, even though the ideal is that there's certain things one should rather die for than commit. Because this was a situation that was almost like being hijacked, that you're not in sound, you're not of sound mind at the time. Maybe you were physically overpowered. Maybe you thought you were going to be raped anyway and were going to be beaten half to death, and you couldn't have stopped the attack. It's not as if by giving your life you could have prevented it. Do you get what I'm saying? So because the circumstances were circumspect, we don't give her the death penalty, okay? And we'd say she's not culpable at all, because she wasn't capable of making a rational decision and it was forced against her. So then the Gemara has a counter rebuttal, and it said maybe, so it's regarded as an unavoidable accident. So we're saying, okay, so if you want to use this as an example, maybe this is only applicable to capital offenses. What do we mean capital offenses? Again, here we're saying that if the alternative is she gets the death penalty, maybe she's off the hook for this unavoidable accident and not complicit at all, because the alternative would be to put her to death, which means in a civil case, it says where with respect to damages, one is liable even if the damage was unavoidable. So maybe that's the case. So in other words, what it's saying is maybe it's more kind to her in this case, because your only option is either she's off the hook or she gets the death penalty as being a tacitly willing party.
Complicit.
So, what, Gav?
Sorry, I said complicit.
Complicit, yes.
Yeah, sorry.
When I said tacitly willing, meaning she's not really willing, but she never objected.
Yeah, so I think it's a delayed response from me, sorry.
So we might have thought, just give me a sec, we might have thought that only in capital cases that we let somebody off the hook for an unavoidable accident, because what's the alternative is to kill her. She's either off the hook or we kill her. So we're saying that maybe when it comes to the laws of damages, for an unavoidable accident, we don't let somebody off the hook. Because here they just pay a bit of money. Nobody loses their life over it. So in other words, even if it was an unavoidable accident, but you also smashed somebody's car up, you would have to pay for it, because even if it wasn't your fault, the guy's car is smashed. And therefore, you have to pay a bit of money. But it's not like you're losing your life over being given a death penalty. So therefore, the Gemara is proposing that maybe it's more lenient on capital cases, because the alternative is she could die. Does that make sense? All right. So it's saying that maybe you can't apply capital cases to cases of civil damages, because the one is the worst is you pay, and the other one, the girl could lose her life. So maybe they're more merciful with the girl, even if it's possible that she could have resisted, because we don't want to put her to death. So we say that maybe she wasn't of sound mind. Maybe she thought she'd be beaten half to death and raped anyway. It was an unavoidable accident. And therefore, she's off the hook. So therefore, why aren't you off the hook if something fell off your shoulders like a pitcher in an unavoidable accident? And maybe the Gemara holds you liable, even according to Rabbi Meir, because it's a case of damages. It's not a case of death penalty. So the worst is you pay a bit of money for liability, but it's not like you have to put the girl to death. So the Gemara rejects it because it says, hang on a second. If one's picture broke in the public domain and he didn't remove it, or his camel fell and he did not stand it up. So by the way, in the actual Mishnah, it talks about a picture that broke or a camel that created damage because it collapsed. So we're going to get to the camel part now, but at the moment we're just pitching the picture. Okay, so Rabbi Meir obligates him to pay for their damage, but the sages say that he is not liable to pay for their damage under the laws of man, but he is liable to pay under the laws of heaven. So what are we saying here? Is that only in Shemaim does Hashem know how liable the person is. Okay, so let me just give you an example of what we're saying. Is that if a guy's walking and he's not concentrating and he's skylarking with his friends or whatever, and the picture broke, Hashem knows. If the guy's walking normally and he's generally a very conscientious person and it broke, but he contributed because he stumbled. Maybe he stumbled after the picture disintegrated from his shoulder and he tripped on the picture itself, or maybe he was walking at a decent pace. So in Shemaim, Hashem knows how culpable that person is and his level of conscientiousness. So they will hold him responsible. But Rabbi Yehuda says he doesn't have to pay in a case if it disintegrated on his shoulder, but he would have to pay if it came off him and he stumbled as it fell. Okay? So the sages agree with Rabbi Meir in a different case. Okay. So if one left one stone, knife, or burden on top of his roof and they fell off in a normal wind and it caused damage, he is liable. Why is he liable? Because in a normal wind, you've got to expect that if you stick something on a roof, that in a normal wind is going to come and blow it off. Does that make sense? So therefore, you've created a hazard because you've got to assume that there can be a normal amount of wind at that season in that area. But a separate case, if you took your jugs on a roof in order to dry them in the sun and they fell off in a wind that was of abnormal strength and caused damage, then he is not liable. Why? Because if you've got a gale force wind and that wasn't to be expected, then obviously you're not culpable at all because you haven't set up the potential of a hazard. It's unusual. So that's an unavoidable accident. So this final part of the brisa explicitly states that even Rab Meir does not hold a damager responsible for an unavoidable accident. So he's saying where there's an abnormal wind, you're not responsible, Rabbi Meir, in this case of jugs on a roof. But if you put your stone, your knife, or your burden, and it's a normal thing, normal wind that comes up, and it's normal for that season, you are responsible because you should have taken that into account. So this is a proof against Abaya and Rabbah, who hold that Rabbi Meir would hold a person responsible automatically if it just disintegrated on his shoulder without the walker stumbling to contribute to that. Does that make sense? And it's got a question mark at this end. Why has it got a question mark? Because although it says that the Gemara refutes Rabbah and Abaya's opinion, it does say that, it's a question mark. We've still got to see what comes forward. But so far we can see that their opinion isn't correct, because in this particular case, it's showing a proof where Rabbi Meir doesn't hold somebody responsible for an unavoidable accident, like an abnormal wind or manufacturing default. Fine. So let's just go on. The Gemara now, it's going to do a comprehensive analysis of this discussion between Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanna Kamma in our Mishnah. Who's the Tanna Kamma? It's an anonymous opinion, and we know that it's written by Rabbi Meir. So think of it rather like Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. Rather, said to Abaya, they argue over 2 points. They argue concerning like damage that was inflicted at the time of the fall, and they argue concerning damage inflicted after the fall. So let me just tell you what the time of the fall actually entails. It entails, number one, at the exact time when something fell, So say it fell, and then as the object fell, the shards shattered and it pierced somebody's leg. That's at the time of the fall. What's also considered at the time of the fall, or you're dropping a pitcher and somebody slipped on the water walking past. What's also considered the time of the fall is the time it takes to clean it up. Does that make sense? Because you can't possibly intervene before that time. Now, once that time is calculated of what it would take you to clean it up, then that is deemed after the fall. So again, it's not exactly at the moment of the fall. It's at the fall and the time it takes to clean up. That's deemed at the time of the fall. After the fall is when you've had sufficient time to clean it up and you've still left it in the public domain and declared it ownerless. Okay. So Abaye basically says, in the case of damage inflicted at the time of the fall, they argue as to whether one who stumbles is considered negligent. One master, the Tana Kamma, maintains that one who stumbles is considered negligent, which means Rabbi Meir. And the other master, Rabbi Yehuda, maintains that one who stumbles is not considered negligent, which would be Rabbi Yehuda. So I've noticed a discrepancy. What is the discrepancy? On 28b3, it says that Rabbi Yehuda would hold somebody responsible if they tripped while taking it off their shoulder. Here, all of a sudden in the Gemara, it turns around and says Abaye would say that Rabbi Yehuda would not maintain that somebody's considered negligent if they took it off their shoulder and it disintegrated and they slipped at the top. So now you see a bit of a contradiction. What's the contradiction? Is that it seems that there are two different opinions on Rabbi Yehuda. It seems that in note number 22 on 28b3, it says that Rabbi Yehuda considers somebody negligent if while they took it off their shoulder, they stumbled and fell because they should have looked where they're going. But if it disintegrated on their shoulder and they never tripped at the time, they're not liable or negligent. Okay? Now it's saying that Rabbi Yehuda says that the person that tripped as he took it off his shoulder is considered to be not negligent because it was an unavoidable accident. And yet Rabbi Meir said that if he did trip, he is responsible because either he should have looked where he's going. He's still responsible for leaving a mess in the public domain. Does that make sense? So that's the issue. So in other words, Rabbi Meir either way considers somebody liable, but in this case, we see two different opinions of Rabbi Yehuda. So I think I might have worked it out. I think so. The first opinion is quoted by Rabbah, R-A-B-B-A-H, Rabbah. And the second opinion is by Abaye. So the second opinion in the Gemara seems to say that Rabbi Yehuda is maintaining that a person isn't liable if while they took it off their shoulder, they tripped. Does that make sense? And it's saying with Rabbi Meir, whether it just disintegrated on their shoulder or they took it off while a person tripped, either way you're liable. So it doesn't matter if you tripped, you didn't, it disintegrated or didn't. Rabbi Meir would hold the person liable and Rabbi Yehuda would not. Does that make sense? And they argue about this in terms of the fall. Okay, Gav, do you understand this point?
Yeah, I think I do.
Okay, so just bottom line, Abaye said that Rav Yehuda maintains that a person that slips, stumbles while he's taking the pitcher off his shoulder is not negligent because it's an unavoidable accident. Rabbi seems to state in note 22 that Rav Yehuda says that the person is liable if he trips while taking it off his shoulders because he should have looked where he was going, and therefore is not liable if it just integrates on his shoulders. Either way, both of them agree. Rabbi Meir said that that person would be liable, according to Rabbi Meir, whether it disintegrated when it just came off their shoulders, or if he tripped and stumbled and fell. Does that make sense? So that's at the time of the fall. That's at the time of the fall. So you've got liability for Rav Meir, non-liability for Rav Yehuda. Okay? So that's where that argument occurs. After the fall, there's a different argument. They argue as to whether who declares his hazardous objects ownerless is liable for damage that they subsequently cause. One master of the Tanakh, which is Rabbi Meir, maintains that one who declares his hazardous objects ownerless is liable, while the other master, Rav Yehuda, maintains that he is not liable. Does that make sense? So Rabbi Meir seems to say that you can't just leave something in the public domain, not clean it up afterwards and say, I'm not liable, it's ownerless, I don't care. Rav Yehuda said that if he says it's ownerless, then in that particular case, he's not liable for the damage if he leaves the mess after. Okay, so it's going to distinguish between somebody that's spilling their water in the jug or their oil or their wine compared to the shards. So Rabbi Yehuda is basically saying that the contents of the jug are valuable, and therefore a person there would not declare it ownerless, and therefore he would be responsible for that portion at which he wouldn't want to give up. But the shards that are in the road from the jug, he does declare ownerless because it has no meaning to him, and therefore it's considered ownerless and is not liable. Rabbi Meir says either way you're liable after the fall if you don't clean it up. Okay, so Abaya gives the basis for the explanation of the Mishnah. And on what is this explanation based? It's based on the fact that the Mishnah states two cases. One slipped on the water and one was injured by the shard. So when you look at it, it seems that the Mishnah is saying that one slipped on the water at the time of the fall, or one was injured by a shard after the fall. So the first case is saying, listen, it's discussing a case during the fall and after the fall, and that's why it's separating the explanation of the Mishnah about the water that slipped at the time of the fall or one who was injured by a shard after the fall. So it's saying that that's the one part of the argument. 29a2, the Gemara challenges Abaya's explanation of the Mishnah because since the Mishnah deals with these two issues, it can be assumed that the Brisa begins, if one's pitcher broke and he did not remove it, etc., also deals with these two issues. In other words, one where his pitcher broke and one where his camel fell. So what it's saying is, listen, there's two basic arguments here. One at the time of the fall and one after. Let me just see how many minutes I've got left, guys. I've got 6 minutes. All right, let me just quickly go through this. So, in conclusion, a person carrying a pitcher of water in the street, he fell. And when he stumbled, the pitcher fell to the ground and broke, and it left a puddle of water and some shards. Okay? And then either one, in other words, at the time of the fall, before the owner had the chance to remove the debris, someone slipped on the water and suffered damage. And since the owner was unable to remove the water, the only basis for holding him liable could be that he should have taken care not to stumble in the first place. So that's where Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda disagree. Rabbi Meir said he's responsible because stumbling is considered negligence. According to Abaya, Rabbi Yehuda said stumbling is not negligence. Rabbi says that Rabbi Yehuda would say if it just disintegrated, there's no negligence, but Rabbi Yehuda would say when he slipped at the time, he was negligent because he should have looked where he was going. Rabbi Meir says either way you have to pay for the damage, even if it just fell off your shoulder. After the fall, in other words, after the owner had the chance to remove the debris and somebody injured himself in the shards, the owner had relinquished ownership of the shards sometime before the accident because it's worthless now. So accordingly, a hazard left in the street is declared ownerless. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, one is not responsible for an ownerless pit in the public domain. Rabbi Meir said he is responsible for it in the public domain. Does that make sense? So those are the two bases of arguments.
Damon, can I say something? So
Sure.
if the pitcher contained wine or olive oil or something of value, and he doesn't relinquish ownership of that, but relinquishes the shards, surely you can't have it both ways. And it's, he declares the shards hefker, but he still wants the wine. And you know what I mean?
Very good question. Okay. So all it's doing is it's using those two examples to illustrate the case. It's saying that if something fell on the ground in that container that was valuable, that it was like olive oil, that 300 Rand at Food Lovers Market for a 2-liter thing of olive oil, okay, extra virgin olive oil. And then the guy's obviously, if he had his wish, he wished he could bring it back in one piece. It's obviously not ownerless. It doesn't matter if he declared it ownerless. Clearly he wanted it because it had value. So therefore, if that created damage and he left that in the public domain and somebody slipped on the olive oil, he'd be liable according to Rabbi Meir and even according to Rabbi Yehuda because it's not ownerless. But the shards in the jug, which now that jug is a worthless, cheap container. Think of it like a glass container of a Coca-Cola bottle, okay? Nobody keeps Coca-Cola bottles of glass, Gavin. So if after drinking it, he discarded it and that broke and that created damage, Rabbi Yehuda said he's not liable because he didn't clean it up because he holds no value to that. It's ownerless. And Rabbi Meir said it caused damage. You're liable. Doesn't matter if it's ownerless. Does that make sense, Kevin? So it's illustrating just the argument of ownerless versus owned public hazard and where the two are holding.
So he created that hazard. He created it.
Yeah, but
from his actions.
What Rav is saying is that if it's ownerless, what Rav said, if it's ownerless and you created a public hazard, you're not liable.
It's like the bits, like the bor,
it's exactly like the bor. And Shmuel is saying it doesn't matter whether it's ownerless or not. If you created a public hazard, you are liable.
We would seem to agree with. That would become more logical, or I would agree with.
Yeah,
most people would agree with that.
We got to see where it comes from. One of the reasons for it is that the Torah says, according to the different interpretation, it uses the example of someone who dug a pit in his own premises and then declared the premises but not the pit ownerless. So in other words, that was the definition. Rav and Shmuel define the biblical definition of a bor differently. That's where it actually comes down to. Is that's where the different definition comes from the Torah. About one sees that the Torah definition is an owned pit, and the other one says it's an ownerless pit. So if it's an owned pit or hazard, then in that case, if it's no longer owned, then the Torah doesn't obligate a person. So that's how Rav would see it. Shmuel sees it as an ownerless pit from his translation of the Torah, and therefore saying whether it's owned or not owned, there's a liability factor. So it's how it was initially translated from the Torah. That's where the basis of the argument came from.
That's a very interesting argument.
Can I just give you an example practically? So the problem with the ownerless part, I understand it, and I understand both guys' points of view, but I'm agreeing more with Rabbi Meir on this, because it's open to abuse. If a guy's building knocking out walls in a building, in a big building, and he leaves all the rubble outside, then just from pure laziness and to save money, he'll just declare it ownerless and disappear. And then
I agree with you, but what he's got to do is then find out.
I think it's more principles theory that they're trying to prove here as opposed to
maybe. No, hang on, Gav.